Hi everyone, welcome back. In this video we're going to take a look at creating motion path objects. So basically a motion path is a curve like you can see here on the screen, and what it does is it acts like a rail and we can have objects move along the curve. So obviously some things might be objects that we're animating. We can attach them to a curve to kind of help somewhat automate the animation process. But we can also use curves to create tracks for things like lights or cameras, where we can get a camera to follow a particular curve by attaching it using the motion curve option. So what we're going to do is look at how that functions. Now there's two different kind of options that we're going to look at here. We're going to look at motion paths, and that's basically attaching an object onto a path. And then we're also going to look at the motion flow or the path flow tool, which basically will make an object bend along a path like a snake. Okay, so let's look at motion paths first. They're the more basic option. So first thing we need is a curve. So I've drawn this curve out in a previous video, which is curve creation. If you haven't watched that yet, go and watch that video first. And then come back to this one, and that'll show you how to build some curves. The basic tool is under the curves tab just here, and you can create a pencil curve or an EP curve using one of these two tools. Okay, so what I need now is basically an object that I'm going to attach to the actual motion path. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to grab a cube tool just here and just draw a little cube box type object like this. Okay, now with that cube object, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop across the channel box, and I'm going to scroll down and look for the inputs and just click on this polycube 1 so I can see these options here. Usually by default they'll be open already, and you'll have to have the cube selected, okay, to see this. What I want to do is grab basically the division value, and it's probably going to be maybe the depth value. Yes. So I'm grabbing this value here, and I'm just clicking on the, I can actually do it here now. There's two different ways of doing this, or three. The old method that I used to use all the time was to click the title of the attribute and then move the cursor into the viewport and middle mouse click and drag left or right to increase or decrease the value, like that. Okay, what I need is about maybe 5 or 6 divisions, something like this. Okay, so that's option 1. That's the one I use most of the time. If you hold the control key down while you're doing that, it'll actually do it in a slower, more stepped way, and it's easier to control exactly how many divisions you get. When you let go, it kind of goes really quickly, really high like that, as you can see there. So if you're trying to control it a bit more, then hold control down. Okay, in this version, we can also just click and drag in the number value just here. So if I click and drag left and right, this acts like a slider now. So it's doing exactly the same thing I did before, but it's doing it directly within the number. Once again, you can hold control down to make it go slower so you can control it a bit more easily. The third option is just to click and type in the number that you want directly and just hit enter. Okay, so yeah, I want about 5 or 6 divisions, something like that. Now, it doesn't really matter at the moment where this object is, but we definitely do want to know which direction it's facing in. Okay, the front of your object should always point along the z-axis. So if you're building a character, the character's face should be looking along the z-axis this direction. It's the direction this little blue line is pointing in, just here. Okay. If it's pointing the other way, it's negative z. Okay. So this is positive z. This is negative z. And if your character is facing this way, or your car or whatever it is facing this way, it's basically backwards. Okay. So always try and point your objects along so they're facing the same direction as positive z. So I have to remember that z is the front of the object. Okay, so let's select the object. Let's select the curve by holding down Shift and clicking on it. Then let's pop up to, we've got to go to rigging. So our menu set needs to be rigging, and we want to go to the constrain menu. We've obviously been looking at a lot of constraints in other videos. I'm just going to actually, I'll go to constrain, and then I'm going to come down to motion paths, and then I'm going to snap that menu off just there. Okay, so we've got attached to motion path, and then we've got our flow path object just here. We're not going to worry about set motion path key, just want to do the other two. Okay, so what we're going to do, if you hover over the option, right down here in the bottom, it actually kind of gives you a tooltip, right? So if I put attached to motion path, hover over that, it says select objects to animate along a motion path followed by the motion path curve. So what that's doing is telling me I've got to select the object, and then I've got to select the curve to attach it to. If you do it the other way around, it won't work. I'm then going to come up to my attach to motion path option box just here, and we'll take a look to see what the settings are. All right, so the first setting basically is time range. Basically what this is going to do by default is time slider, and that's what this is, right? So what it's going to do is set up the animation to go from the start of the curve all the way around back to the end of the curve over the duration that we can see on the slider, which is 120 frames. All right. If I want to have it start at a particular frame and end at a particular frame, what I can do is use start end, and when I activate that, it'll give me, you know, these options here. So that would start at frame 1 and end at frame 30. So what that means is the object would start at the beginning of the curve, and it would go all the way around and get back to the end by frame 30, or on frame 30. If I hit start, what it's going to do is it's going to start the animation from whatever frame number I type in here. So this number would correlate to whatever frame number I wanted to start on here. So if I wanted to start on 25, type 25 here, basically nothing would happen until frame 25, and then it would move. Okay, what I'm going to do is go time slider, and just so that this is easy enough to see, I'm going to highlight this second number just here, and I'm going to type in 50. All right, so now what I've got is 50 frames in my animation. That's 2 seconds, because we're animating at 25 frames per second. So every second we get 25 individual pictures or individual frames in the sequence. Okay, so time slider, our time slider is 50 frames. Basically here what we want to double check is what the front axis is for our object, and also the up axis for the world. Now remember, I was talking before, our object should always point along the Z axis. Okay, that means at the moment the front axis is thinking that it's the up axis. So if I attach this now, what would happen is the object would flip so that the top of this box would be pointing along the curve, and it would kind of vertically run along the curve. What I want is for this to go along the curve like a train or a snake. So what I'm going to do is tell it that my front axis is actually the Z axis. That's this direction here. My up axis is going to be my Y axis. Right, so I want the top of the box to stay up. Okay. If I do X axis, it's going to flip onto its side. Okay. Now the world up type is vector, and it therefore uses the world up vector setting just here. This is X, Y, and Z. Our up world axis, or our up axis in our world, is Y by default, and it's already set to Y. You can see here Y has a value of 1, which means that's currently the up direction it's going to take. Now we've got a couple of other settings here. Sometimes what happens is you'll attach something and you will have messed these settings up. Quite often what will happen is you'll put sort of the negative axis in, and so what we can do, especially like with things like the world up vector, you know, that might be 1, but you know, it might end up being -1 in reality. So these options here, we can access these later on, and we can just click these and it'll reverse either the front to the back or vice versa, or the up to down and vice versa. The final option here is bank. What this does is it will make this object twist side to side as it goes around bend. So it's like it leans into the bend like the way that an aircraft would bank when it's turning. So it kind of goes onto its side and then turns. Or if you have a look at the way motorcycle riders, especially like motocross or, you know, like motorcycle Grand Prix, bikes that are traveling around corners they'll tilt onto their side so they don't slide out and go off the side of the curve or the turn. So the bank value does that. I'm going to show you both options, with and without. I'm going to start without. So with these settings, I'm going to hit apply. And you can see our object jumps. And it's now sitting at the starting point of the curve. And it's also lined itself up with the direction the curve is pointing at that point, or at that time, right? Notice how the box is still straight though. It's not curved or anything. It hasn't bent to follow the shape of the curve. Okay, so if I press play, let me just turn the smoothing on here for a second. Might hit motion blur as well. That won't do anything. If I now press play, you can see that it's going to run around there. Notice how it pauses at the start. It slows down. Okay. But you can see that that's sort of working okay. Now, we can always go into the graph editor and we can modify the speed and sort of the pausing, okay? But you can see what's happening there. Basically, the curve, the curve is, you know, driving the direction that object is moving. Now, notice here it's blurring. That's because I've switched motion blur on just here. If I turn that off, you won't get the blurring. Okay, so you can see how that's working there. Now, let's go and change that bank value. I can't do it in here. What I need to do is go into the attributes for it. Now, sometimes you can get it in here. You might get a couple of options here. Usually what I'll do is I'll go into the motion path attribute editor, right? So what we want to do is go into the motion path 1 tab inside the attribute editor. Attribute editor is this button just here. If I go down here, you can see there's the inverse up, there's the inverse front. So if I mess those up, I could just tick these on and off. I can also tell it which is the front axis and the up axis if I need to change those. But what I want to do is activate bank. So I'm going to click bank, and you can see here bank limit is 90. So this is at most, it will angle itself on a 90-degree angle when it goes around a sharp bend, right? So I'm just going to minimize this for a second. Go back to the start. So what we want to do is sort of have a look at what happens to the box as it goes around a bend. So as it goes around a sharp bend, you can see there, it's actually angling itself. It's angling this way to kind of follow the curve. And it's more pronounced when things are going up and down, or when things are going around a sharp corner. So you'd probably get something just here quite heavy. See there? So that's banking. And then it flips the other way. So now it's on this way. Okay. So what that does is it makes it feel a little bit more natural as it's moving around. It makes it feel a little bit more lifelike. Obviously, if you're doing something like a train using this option, a train is not going to twist side to side, okay, because it's got to stay on the track. So unless the track actually curves or kind of leans up sideways, the train would always be level, so you wouldn't use banking. If you're doing something like a bird flying or a plane flying, then you would use banking, because those kinds of things do bank when they turn. Okay. Now, obviously, you can limit the bank. Okay, you could have this thing flip almost completely upside down by putting in 180. All right, and you can also increase the bank scale. Okay, so let's get to a frame where it is banking. So it is banking there, just a little bit. So if I grab bank scale, if I hold down Control and click and drag there in that number, that it basically turns into a slider. By increasing the bank scale, what it's doing, it's basically multiplying the effect. So if I go to 2, it's going to bank twice as much there as it normally would. So I can kind of over-exaggerate it. If it's too subtle for my liking, I can increase the bank scale and it'll actually kind of multiply and magnify the effect. So I get much more kind of banking on curves like that. Now, because that's only 2 seconds, and it's quite a long curve, it's a very long curve, it's very quick. But like I said, you could slow it down in the graph editor. Okay, so that's the banking option. All right, let's make one more adjustment to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the flow path object. Okay, and what I'm going to do is select the box. So select the box like this. And I'm going to go flow path object options like that. And what I want to do is, for this, I'm just going to leave the options as they are. Okay. Really what you need to know is these division numbers here, 5, 2, and 2. These are what, in part, are going to allow this object to bend and follow the curve more closely. Okay. If you reduce these numbers too much, you won't get any bending occurring. You might get some weird twisting happen. So by default, generally speaking, I usually would recommend, until you're used to this system, just leave these as they are. So I'm just going to hit flow. Okay, so now what I'm getting, basically, and it's hard to see, it's hard to work out because we used a box. Basically what's happened is, it's created this FFD1 lattice object. It's basically a cage that fits absolutely perfectly around the box. And because it's sort of rectangular in nature, it's hard to see against the box. If I click this button here, we can see the box divisions. The green lines are actually this lattice. So a lattice is essentially a cage. When you move the lattice points around, it actually deforms the model that it's attached to. So you can bend a lattice and that will bend the model. So what's happening is the lattice is going to bend as the object goes around the curve, as it travels around. So what should happen is, you can see there, the box starts to bend and follow the curve more like a snake rather than like a train carriage. A train carriage is always going to remain rigid. A snake is going to twist and turn to follow the shape that it's conforming to, right? And you can see here, the bank option is also twisting the box. So now we're getting way more out of that, way more out of the actual bank option than we got before. Before it just leaned. Now it's actually twisting as it travels around the different parts of the curve. Now this little bit in here is going to be quite interesting. As it gets to that final bend just there. You can see that because that bend is so tight, it's twisting a lot. It's because it's coming around this corner, it's banked really heavily this way. So this is almost on its side. But then this front end has already gone around that and is now changing directions the other way. And so the whole thing is twisting very heavily. So what we could do there is reduce the bank scale in the motion path option. Or what we would have to do is modify the curve and kind of make it a little bit more of a softer curve rather than it being so squishy. Now you can modify this curve even with this attached and it will automatically follow the new shape of the curve. So that's another option as well. You can actually edit the curves with things attached. But that's basically what's happening there. Now what I'm going to do is actually slow this down, right? So what I'm going to do here is type in maybe 200 into this number. That's going to give me 200 frames. Now that doesn't change the animation. It's still only going to go over like 50 frames because that's what it was set up for. But if I select the object and I now open up my animation editor, my graph editor, so Windows Animation Editor's graph editor, okay, there's the curve. There's the motion path, right? Just there. So if I take that point and I move that up to 200, if I select this and I go 200 just here, it'll extend the animation up to 200 frames and it'll slow down. So instead of it being 2 seconds, that'll now be like 8 seconds. Right? So I'll turn that off. And then when I hit play, you can see now you get a bit more of a nicer movement. The movement's exactly the same. Now I do find it tends to, when you modify that after you've done the flow object, it messes it up. So what you might need to do is make sure you've got the speed right first before adding the flow path, because it does mess it up at the end. That's something I have noticed. But you can see there about 8 seconds, that's a very nice speed to get that going. Now if you find that it's going really quickly, right click in your timeline and just double check your playback speed is set to real time or play every frame maximum real time. If it's real time, if it's play every frame free, the computer will play it as quickly as it's able to, which usually is going to be way, way, way faster than the actual animation is. So always double check that you're playing back at real time. Yeah, and make sure that the speed is all set up before you do your flow path object, because otherwise you get this weird kind of stuttering at the beginning and at the end. Okay, so that's motion paths and flow path objects. Comes in really handy, and it's nice for sort of doing sort of basic automated animations. You know, you can do like lines of traffic on a freeway, or birds flying across the screen using this kind of system. But it also works well for creating custom directional curves or paths for things like lights and cameras to follow. That way you can replicate the same camera move over and over and over again. Yep, so that's it. We'll leave this one here, and I'll see you again soon.